Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we're descending into one of history's darkest chapters, exploring places where sunlight never reached and screams echoed through stone corridors for centuries. Medieval dungeons. Yes, those underground chambers of terror that have haunted our imagination for generations. But here's the thing. Most of what you think you know about these places is probably wrong. So before we begin this journey into the depths, take a moment to hit that like button if you're ready to uncover some disturbing truths, and subscribe if you want more deep dives into history's most chilling secrets. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and whether you're brave enough to visit one of these places in person. Now, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's descend together into the medieval world's most terrifying spaces. Picture this. You're standing outside a massive stone castle in the year 1400. The walls tower above you, thick and imposing. But it's what lies beneath that should truly terrify you. Below your feet, carved directly into the bedrock, are chambers designed not just to hold prisoners, but to break them completely. These weren't just jails. They were instruments of psychological warfare, architectural nightmares built with one purpose in mind: to strip away every shred of human dignity and hope. The medieval dungeon wasn't some Hollywood invention. It was a calculated system of control, fear, and punishment that operated for centuries across Europe. And the reality was far more sophisticated and disturbing than any movie could portray. These underground labyrinths were found everywhere. Royal palaces, noble castles, church buildings, even monasteries had their own versions of these hellish chambers. Each one carefully designed to serve multiple functions, from simple imprisonment to complex psychological manipulation. Let's start with the architecture itself, because every stone was placed with malicious intent. Medieval dungeon builders understood something that modern psychologists are only now beginning to grasp. Environment shapes the mind. These chambers were deliberately constructed to induce claustrophobia, despair, and complete helplessness. Thick walls, sometimes 5 feet of solid stone, weren't just about keeping people in. They were about keeping sound in. The screams, the pleading, the final moments of broken prisoners, all of it stayed trapped within those suffocating walls. The entrance to most dungeons was through a single heavy door, often double reinforced with iron bands and multiple locks. But here's where it gets interesting. Many dungeons had no doors at all. Instead, prisoners were lowered through openings in the ceiling, trap doors that would slam shut above them, leaving them in complete darkness, with no visible means of escape. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. You weren't just imprisoned, you were buried alive. Ventilation was minimal, if it existed at all. The air inside these chambers was thick, stagnant, and poisonous. A mixture of human waste, rotting food, mold, and decay that would assault your senses the moment you were thrown inside. This wasn't accidental. The builders knew that sensory torture could be just as effective as physical pain. Your nose would burn, your eyes would water, and your throat would close up from the toxic atmosphere that surrounded you 24 hours a day. The floors were another carefully planned element of torture. In some dungeons, like the infamous oubliette at Warwick Castle, built by William the Conqueror in 1068, the floor was deliberately paved with sharp, jagged stones that jutted up at painful angles. Imagine being thrown into a space so narrow you couldn't stand upright, forced to lie on stones designed to cause constant agony. You couldn't move away from the pain because there was nowhere to go. The ceiling was just inches above your head, creating a claustrophobic nightmare that would drive most people insane within days. But let's talk about the different types of dungeons, because medieval architects had created an entire taxonomy of suffering. At the bottom of this hierarchy were what the Inquisition called cells of mercy. These were reserved for wealthy prisoners who could afford to buy their way into slightly better conditions. Still underground, still terrifying, but with basic furniture like a stool and a crude bed. These prisoners had hope. They knew that if they surrendered their wealth to their captors, they might eventually see sunlight again. One step down were the cells of penitence. These were small round towers about 10 feet in diameter, painted white to create a disorienting, asylum-like atmosphere. Very little light was allowed in, just enough to let prisoners see the walls closing in around them. The psychological impact was deliberate. White walls in near darkness create visual distortions, making the space seem to shift and move around you. Prisoners would often report seeing things that weren't there, shadows dancing in their peripheral vision, faces appearing in the stone. But if you refused to cooperate, if you wouldn't confess to whatever crime they wanted to pin on you, you'd be moved to a true dungeon. Walls 5 feet thick, double doors, and complete darkness. No conversation was allowed, no human contact whatsoever. Food, if you could call it that, was worth less than a penny a day. Human waste was removed every 4 days, meaning you'd spend 3 days sitting in your own filth before anyone bothered to acknowledge your existence. The guards who managed these places were often hereditary positions, passed from father to son like a family business. These weren't random thugs. They were professionals who had refined the art of human suffering over generations. They understood exactly how much food to give a prisoner to keep them alive, but weak. They knew which sounds would drive someone mad in the darkness. They had perfected the timing of visits, the rhythm of hope and despair that would eventually break even the strongest will. And then there was the ultimate horror, the oubliette. The French word means to forget, and that tells you everything you need to know about these chambers. They were designed to make people disappear, not just from the world, but from memory itself. Most oubliettes were narrow vertical shafts, sometimes built into the walls of upper floors rather than underground. They earned the nickname bottle dungeons because of their shape, wide at the bottom, narrow at the top. Prisoners thrown into an oubliette had just enough space to tilt their heads back and see the grate above them, a cruel reminder of the world they'd never rejoin. They couldn't sit properly, couldn't lie down comfortably, couldn't stand upright. Most would die slowly of starvation and despair, their bodies eventually discovered years later, when someone bothered to look down into the forgotten depths. But here's what's truly chilling. Many oubliettes have been discovered with multiple skeletons inside, layers of human remains from different time periods. When a new prisoner was thrown in, they'd land on the bones of those who came before them. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. You could see your fate written in the remains around you, understanding that you too would be forgotten, that your bones would cushion the fall of the next victim. The conditions inside these dungeons were beyond anything most people today can imagine. Rats were everywhere, not just living alongside prisoners, but actively hunting them. Weak prisoners, those too sick or injured to defend themselves, would often be partially eaten alive by vermin. The lucky ones died quickly. Others would wake to find chunks of their flesh missing, rat bites covering their bodies, their blood attracting even more creatures from the darkness. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and infections that had no names would sweep through prison populations like wildfire. But here's the twisted part. The authorities often saw disease as a useful tool. If a prisoner died of illness before confessing, well, that was God's judgment. If they survived, they were obviously guilty and deserved whatever punishment awaited them. It was a win-win situation for the jailers. Water was another weapon in the dungeon arsenal. Some prisoners received just enough to stay alive, a few drops a day that would be absorbed by their swollen tongues before it could provide any real relief. Others were subjected to the opposite torture, chained in cells that would flood during heavy rains, forcing them to stand in sewage and filth that rose to their necks. They couldn't drown, but they couldn't escape the constant threat of drowning either. The sounds of medieval dungeons created their own form of torture. Chains clanking in the darkness, the scraping of heavy doors, distant moans and whispers from other prisoners, the scratching of rats in the walls. These sounds would echo through stone corridors, amplified and distorted until prisoners couldn't tell if what they were hearing was real or imagined. The isolation was so complete that many prisoners would begin talking to themselves, then to imaginary companions, then finally descend into complete madness. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of dungeon life was the unpredictability. Prisoners never knew when someone might come for them. A sudden torchlight in the darkness could mean food, could mean torture, could mean execution, could mean nothing at all. Guards would sometimes open cell doors just to look inside, then leave without a word. This constant state of anticipation, of never knowing what came next, would break minds faster than any physical torture. The hierarchy among prisoners themselves added another layer of horror to dungeon life. In crowded cells, the strong would prey on the weak, forming brutal societies where violence was the only currency. New prisoners would be robbed of whatever possessions they had, forced to give up their food, their water, even their space. The guards encouraged this behavior because it meant less work for them. Let the prisoners torture each other. Women prisoners faced additional horrors that history has largely tried to forget. Female guards and interrogators, though less common than their male counterparts, were often more creative in their cruelty. They understood psychological pressure points that male torturers missed, using shame, humiliation, and sexual threat as weapons more devastating than any physical device. The Church's role in all of this was particularly disturbing because it wrapped systematic torture in the language of salvation. Inions were present, acquisition, dunged as places of spiritual healing, where confession would lead to redemption. The twisted logic was that physical pain was temporary, but eternal damnation was forever. Therefore, any amount of earthly suffering was justified if it saved a soul. Priests would visit prisoners not to provide comfort, but to increase psychological pressure, using religious guilt as another instrument of torture. Tonight we've only scratched the surface of these underground chambers of horror. We've talked about the architecture of despair, the calculated cruelty of dungeon design, and the systematic way these places stripped away human dignity. But we haven't yet explored the specific instruments of torture that filled these chambers, the notorious devices that have become synonymous with medieval cruelty. We haven't discussed the famous prisoners whose stories echo through history, or the incredible escapes that proved even the most secure dungeons weren't impenetrable. Most importantly, we need to separate the myths from the reality, because while Hollywood has given us Iron Maidens and other fictional devices, the real instruments of medieval torture were far more sophisticated and terrifying than any movie prop. These were precision instruments, designed by craftsmen who understood anatomy, psychology, and the exact limits of human endurance. The reality of medieval torture was both more systematic and more horrifying than most people realize. These weren't random acts of cruelty carried out by sadistic guards. They were carefully planned procedures, executed by professionals who had turned human suffering into an exact science. The torture chamber itself was as carefully designed as any cathedral or castle hall, with every element serving a specific purpose in the systematic destruction of the human spirit. Let's start with the rack, perhaps the most infamous of all medieval torture devices. This wasn't some crude contraption thrown together by village blacksmiths. The rack was a precision instrument, usually made of oak or other hardwoods, raised slightly from the ground with rollers at both ends. The victim's ankles would be fastened to one roller, their wrists chained to the other. Then, through an intricate system of pulleys and levers, the rollers would slowly rotate, stretching the victim's body with mathematical precision. The genius of the rack lay not just in its physical effects, but in its psychological impact. Victims could see exactly what was going to happen to them. They could watch as the operators prepared the device, could hear the creaking of the wood and the clanking of the chains. The anticipation was often more terrifying than the actual torture itself. As the pressure increased, joints would dislocate with audible pops, shoulders would separate from their sockets, and eventually, if the process continued, Limbs would be torn completely from the body. But the rack operators weren't trying to kill their victims quickly. Death was easy. Breaking someone's will while keeping them alive, that required skill. Experienced torturers knew exactly how much pressure to apply, how long to maintain the stretch, when to release the tension to prevent permanent damage that might end the interrogation prematurely. They could keep a victim on the rack for hours, days even, applying just enough force to cause excruciating pain without causing immediate death. The Spanish donkey, or Judas cradle, represented an even more sophisticated understanding of human anatomy and suffering. This device consisted of a sharp, idle wooden or pyram metal point mounted on a sawhorse-like frame. The victim would be positioned so that their most sensitive areas rested on the point, with weights attached to their legs to increase the pressure gradually. The torture could last for days, with the point slowly penetrating deeper into the body as gravity and additional weights did their work. What made the Judas cradle particularly horrific was its variability. Operators could control every aspect of the torture, from the angle of the point to the amount of weight applied. They could increase or decrease the pressure at will, creating cycles of agony and relief that would drive victims to the edge of madness. Some variations included heated metal points or surfaces coated with salt to increase the even pain further. The breaking wheel took public spectacle and combined it with methodical torture in ways that seem almost impossible to comprehend today. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about sending a message to entire communities. The victim would be tied to a large wooden wheel, their limbs spread wide and secured with iron rings driven deep into the ground. Then, using another wheel or heavy wooden clubs, the executioner would systematically break every major bone in the victim's body. The process followed a specific sequence, first the fingers and toes, then the hands and feet, working methodically up the arms and legs. Each bone would be broken individually, with deliberate pauses between strikes the pain to let fully register. The victim would remain conscious throughout most of the process, screaming for mercy that would never come. Finally, when every limb had been shattered, the victim would be left to die slowly on the wheel, sometimes taking days to finally succumb to their injuries. These public executions drew massive crowds. Families would bring children to watch, treating the spectacle as entertainment and education rolled into one. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy authority. But there was also a darker element at work. The crowds weren't just watching passively. They were participating in a collective act of sanctioned cruelty, becoming complicit in the systematic destruction of another human being. The head crusher represented medieval understanding of anatomy, combined with sadistic precision that's difficult to comprehend. This device consisted of a metal cap that fitted over the victim's skull, with a screw mechanism that would slowly apply pressure from above, while the victim's chin rested on a metal bar below. As the screw was tightened, the pressure would build gradually, first causing unbearable headaches, then beginning to crack teeth and compress the jaw. The operators could control the exact amount of pressure, turning the screw a fraction at a time while watching for the victim's reactions. As the pressure increased, the victim's eyes would begin to bulge from their sockets. Their teeth would crack and crumble, and their jaw would slowly compress until it eventually shattered. But the real horror was in the timing. Skilled operators could keep victims conscious throughout the entire process, ensuring they experienced every moment of their skull being slowly crushed. What's particularly disturbing about these devices is how common they were. Nearly every major castle, monastery, and administrative centre across Europe had its own collection of torture instruments. These weren't rare or exotic tools reserved for special occasions. They were standard equipment, as common in medieval justice as handcuffs are in modern law enforcement. But who were the people operating these devices? The executioners and torturers of medieval Europe weren't random sadists. They were professionals, often from hereditary families who had passed down the techniques of their trade through generations. Take Franz Schmidt. whose detailed diary from Nuremberg provides us with one of the most complete records of medieval execution practices. Over his career, Schmidt documented 394 executions. But his records reveal something unexpected about the medieval justice system. Schmidt wasn't a mindless killer. His diary shows a man who took pride in his work, who saw himself as an essential part of the legal system. He recorded not just the executions, but also acts of mercy, times when he reduced sentences or found ways to minimize suffering. His entries reveal a complex individual operating within a system that modern people struggle to understand. These hereditary executioners developed techniques that were passed down like family recipes. They knew exactly where to place the blade for a clean beheading, how to tie knots that would provide quick strangulation, which muscles to cut to disable a victim without killing them immediately. This wasn't random violence. It was craftsmanship applied to human destruction. The role of women in medieval torture challenges many of our assumptions about gender roles in the Middle Ages. While most executioners were men, women played significant roles in interrogation and psychological torture, particularly during the Inquisition. Female inquisitors and torturers often focused on psychological manipulation rather than physical violence, using shame, religious guilt, and sexual humiliation as their primary weapons. These women understood pressure points that male torturers often missed. They could identify a victim's deepest fears and insecurities, then exploit them with surgical precision. A devoutly religious prisoner might be tortured with blasphemous imagery or forced to participate in mock sacrilege. A mother might be threatened with harm to her children. A proud nobleman might be subjected to public humiliation that would destroy his social standing even if he survived the interrogation. The Church's involvement in systematic torture represents one of the most disturbing aspects of medieval justice. The Inquisition didn't just tolerate torture, it refined, systematized it, and inquisitors developed detailed manuals describing proper torture techniques, legal procedures for extracting confessions, and theological justifications for inflicting pain in the name of salvation. But here's where historical reality diverges dramatically from popular belief. Recent scholarship has revealed that the Inquisition actually used torture far less frequently than commonly assumed. Historian Helen Mary Carroll notes that the common view of medieval justice, as primarily based on torture and execution, is often unfair and inaccurate. The famous inquisitor Bernard Gui, who presided over 930 heresy cases, sent only 42 people to secular authorities for execution. The truth is that the Inquisition often provided more lenient treatment than secular courts. Accused heretics and witches would sometimes specifically request transfer to Inquisition custody because they knew they'd receive more humane treatment. Rather than physical torture, inquisitors preferred psychological pressure, lengthy imprisonment, and social isolation to extract confessions. The popular image of Inquisition torture chambers filled with elaborate devices is largely a creation of later Protestant propaganda and Victorian Gothic imagination. The actual methods used by inquisitors were often simpler and left fewer physical marks. Sleep deprivation, prolonged standing, exposure to extreme temperatures, and psychological manipulation were far more common than the elaborate mechanical torture devices that populate our nightmares. This doesn't mean the Inquisition was benevolent. The psychological torture they employed could be just as devastating as physical pain. Prisoners would be kept in solitary confinement for months or years, never knowing when they might be called for questioning. They'd be subjected to mock trials, false promises of release, and constant uncertainty about their fate. The goal wasn't just to extract confessions, but to completely break down the victim's sense of self and reality. The classification system used by the Inquisition reveals a sophisticated understanding of psychological manipulation. The progression from cells of mercy through cells of penitence to full dungeons wasn't random. Each level was designed to increase pressure gradually, while always offering the possibility of reprieve for those willing to confess and submit. to church authority. Wealthy prisoners in cells of mercy were given hope deliberately. They could see that cooperation led to better treatment, that submission to church authority could result in eventual freedom. This created a powerful incentive for confession that was far more effective than simple physical torture. The prisoner became complicit in their own psychological destruction, choosing submission over resistance. The cells of penitence used environmental factors to break down mental resistance. The white walls in near darkness created visual distortions that would gradually erode a prisoner's grip on reality. The isolation prevented any social interaction that might reinforce the prisoner's sense of identity or purpose. Over time, many prisoners would begin to question their own memories, their own beliefs, even their own names. When prisoners were finally moved to true dungeons, they'd already been psychologically prepared for complete surrender. The physical deprivation, the darkness, the silence, all of these elements worked together to strip away the last vestiges of personal identity. By the time they were brought before the interrogators, many prisoners were so broken that they'd confess to anything just to end the psychological torture. But not everyone submitted quietly to dungeon imprisonment. Medieval prisoners demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in their attempts to escape, even under seemingly impossible conditions. The thick stone walls and heavy doors weren't as impenetrable as their builders intended. Prisoners would spend months or even years slowly working at mortar joints with nothing more than spoons or small stones, gradually loosening individual blocks until they could create openings large enough to crawl through. One popular escape method involved bribing guards, which was more common than authorities liked to admit. Guards were often poorly paid and faced constant temptation from wealthy prisoners willing to offer substantial sums for their freedom. The hereditary nature of many guard positions meant that corruption could become institutionalized within prison systems, passed down through families along with the job itself. The art of deception provided another avenue for escape. Prisoners would disguise themselves as guards, clergy, or other authorized personnel who had legitimate access to dungeon areas. Some would steal or improvise clothing, create false documents, or simply rely on confident behavior to walk past security. Others would feign death, hoping to be carried out with actual corpses and then escape during transport to burial sites. The most famous medieval escape involved techniques that required outside assistance and careful planning. John Gerard's 1597 escape from the Tower of London involved sliding across the moat on a rope thrown from outside accomplices. This type of coordinated escape required extensive networks of supporters willing to risk their own lives to free important prisoners. These escape attempts reveal something important about medieval prison security. Despite the imposing architecture and brutal conditions, the systems were often undermanned and poorly coordinated. Guards might be drunk, distracted, or simply overwhelmed by the number of prisoners they were supposed to monitor. The very isolation that made dungeons so psychologically devastating also made them vulnerable to prisoners who could exploit gaps in surveillance. The consequences for guards who allowed escapes were severe enough to create a culture of extreme vigilance. But they also led to increased brutality, as guards tried to demonstrate their dedication to security. A guard who lost a prisoner might face demotion, physical punishment, or even execution, depending on the importance of the escapee and the political climate of the time. This system of accountability created an environment where guards had personal incentives to maintain harsh conditions and prevent any possibility of prisoner cooperation or planning. The fear of punishment often made guards more cruel than necessary, as they sought to prove their loyalty and competence through excessive brutality. Medieval prisoners also developed sophisticated forms of resistance beyond simple escape attempts. Sabotage was a common form of silent protest, with prisoners secretly damaging torture instruments or attempting to manipulate interrogators into revealing their plans or weaknesses. Some prisoners would resort to extreme measures like self-starvation, deliberate self-harm, or feigned madness to avoid torture or execution. These tactics weren't always successful, but they demonstrate the lengths to which people would go to maintain some sense of agency and dignity, even under the most oppressive conditions. The psychological battle between captor and prisoner was often as complex and strategic as any military campaign, with both sides constantly adapting their techniques in response to their opponent's moves. Prison revolts were another form of resistance that occurred more frequently than historical records might suggest. These uprisings could take many forms, from coordinated violent attacks on guards to subtle forms of non-compliance like work refusals or communication strikes. The crowded conditions in many medieval prisons actually facilitated organization among prisoners, allowing them to plan and coordinate resistance activities. The most successful prison revolts often combined multiple elements: internal organization, external support, guard corruption, and favorable political circumstances. Prisoners would sometimes coordinate their efforts with outside political movements, timing their revolts to coincide with broader social upheavals that might distract authorities or provide opportunities for escape. But the most terrifying aspect of medieval prison revolts wasn't their frequency, it was their aftermath. When authorities crushed these uprisings, and they almost always did, the punishments that followed were designed to serve as warnings that would echo through every dungeon across Europe. Prisoners who participated in revolts faced tortures so severe that other inmates would sometimes turn against their fellow prisoners rather than risk being associated with rebellion. The suppression of the 1381 revolt at Newgate Prison in London provides a chilling example of how authorities dealt with organised prisoner resistance. When guards discovered that inmates had been secretly digging tunnels and core outside, dinating with supporters of the prison walls, they didn't just punish the ringleaders. They implemented what they called collective responsibility, subjecting every prisoner in the affected sections to brutal interrogation designed to root out any possible conspirators. The interrogation techniques used during these crackdowns reveal the sophisticated psychology employed by medieval authorities. Rather than simply torturing everyone equally, they would select random prisoners for especially brutal treatment while forcing others to watch. This created an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust among inmates that was far more effective than any physical barrier in preventing future organized resistance. But let's talk about who actually ended up in these dungeons, because the prisoner population was far more diverse than most people realize. Yes, there were common criminals, murderers, thieves, and bandits who posed genuine threats to medieval society. But the majority of dungeon inhabitants were political prisoners, religious dissidents, debtors, and people who had simply found themselves on the wrong side of powerful individuals. The political prisoners were often the most dangerous from the authorities' perspective, not because they were violent, but because they represented ideas that could threaten the entire social order. These weren't just failed rebels or captured enemy soldiers. They were scholars who questioned church doctrine, merchants who challenged trade monopolies, craftsmen who tried to organize guilds without noble permission, and peasants who had spoken too openly about the injustices they faced daily. Take the case of Roger Bacon, the 13th century English philosopher who spent years in Franciscan prisons, not for any crime, but for his scientific experiments and writings that challenged accepted religious teachings. His imprisonment wasn't about punishment, it was about suppression. The authorities feared that his ideas about experimental science and rational inquiry could undermine the church's intellectual authority. Religious prisoners formed another significant portion of the dungeon population, and their treatment reveals the complex relationship between faith and power in medieval society. Heretics, as they were labelled, weren't necessarily people who rejected Christianity entirely. Often they were devout Christians who interpreted scripture differently than church authorities preferred. The Caths, southern France, Thiers in Waldensians in the Alps, Theollards in England, all faced systematic persecution, not for abandoning faith, but for practicing it in ways that threatened established religious hierarchies. The legal system that fed prisoners into these dungeons operated on principles that would seem alien to modern justice. There was no presumption of innocence, no right to legal representation, no protection against self-incrimination. Instead, the system operated on the assumption that accusations usually had some basis in truth, and that extracting confessions was the primary goal of any legal proceeding. Trial by ordeal remained common throughout much of the medieval period, with accused individuals subjected to tests that supposedly revealed divine judgment about their guilt or innocence. Trial by hot iron required the accused to carry a red-hot piece of metal for a specific distance. If their burns healed cleanly within 3 days, they were innocent. If the wounds festered, they were guilty. Trial by water involved throwing bound accused individuals into rivers or ponds. If they floated, they were guilty and would be executed. If they sank and drowned, they were innocent, but dead. These ordeals weren't primitive superstitions practiced by ignorant peasants. They were formal legal procedures endorsed by church authorities and incorporated into official legal codes across Europe. The underlying theology held that God would intervene to protect the innocent, making the results of these trials divine pronouncements rather than random chance. When trial by ordeal was finally banned by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, it was replaced by inquisitorial procedures that were in many ways more terrifying. Instead of leaving guilt or innocence to divine intervention, the new system placed ultimate authority in the hands of trained interrogators who used systematic torture and psychological manipulation to extract confessions from accused individuals. The inquisitorial process began with secret denunciations. Anyone could accuse anyone else of heresy, witchcraft, or other crimes against the faith, and these accusations would be investigated without the knowledge of the accused. The first sign of trouble for most victims was armed guards arriving with at their door arrest warrants base. They'd on evidence had never seen and accusations they had never heard. Once arrested, accused individuals would be held in isolation while investigators gathered additional evidence. This preliminary imprisonment could last months or years, during which time the accused would have no contact with family, friends, or legal counsel. They would not be told what specific charges they faced or who had accused them. This uncertainty was itself a form of psychological torture designed to weaken resistance before formal interrogation began. The interrogation rooms where confessions were extracted were designed with the same attention to psychological detail as the dungeons themselves. Located in monastery basements or castle towers, these chambers combined religious symbolism with instruments of torture in ways calculated to break down mental resistance. Crucifixes and religious paintings covered the walls, reminding prisoners that their suffering was sanctioned by divine authority. The interrogators themselves were often highly educated men who combined theological training with practical knowledge of human psychology. They understood that different types of people responded to different forms of pressure. A proud nobleman might be broken by public humiliation more effectively than physical torture. A devout peasant might confess quickly when threatened with excommunication. A merchant might surrender when faced with the loss of property and social standing. The questioning process followed elaborate protocols designed to trap accused individuals in contradictions or admissions of guilt. Interrogators would ask the same questions repeatedly over multiple sessions, looking for inconsistencies in answers that could be used as evidence of deception. They would present evidence, claim false that co-conspirators had already confessed, and promise lenient treatment in exchange for cooperation. Physical torture, when it was employed, followed strict guidelines intended to maximize pain while minimizing the risk of permanent injury or death. The goal wasn't to kill or cripple prisoners, but to cause suffering so intense that they would say anything to make stop. Torture sessions were limited in duration and frequency to ensure that prisoners remained capable of providing coherent confessions. The strappado was one of the most common interrogation tools, involving hoisting prisoners by their arms, tied behind their backs, until their shoulders dislocated. Weights could be attached to their feet to increase the pain and speed the dislocation process. Skilled operators knew exactly how long they could maintain this position without causing permanent damage, and they could repeat the process multiple times over several days. Water torture took many forms, from the Chinese water drop technique that drove prisoners mad through constant dripping on their foreheads, to more aggressive methods that simulated drowning. The funnel technique involved forcing large quantities of water down a prisoner's throat while they were restrained on an inclined table, creating the sensation of drowning without perhaps actually killing them. But the most psychologically devastating aspect of medieval interrogation was its unpredictability. Prisoners never knew when they might be summoned for questioning, what methods might be employed, or how long the process might continue. Some prisoners were tortured for days before being released without explanation. Others were held for years without ever being formally questioned. This uncertainty created a state of constant anxiety that often proved more effective than any physical torture. The confessions extracted through these methods were considered legally valid and were used as evidence in trials that were largely ceremonial affairs. Once someone had confessed under torture, their guilt was established, and the trial focused on determining appropriate punishment rather than establishing innocence or guilt. The range of punishments available to medieval courts was extensive and carefully calibrated to match both the severity of the crime and the social status of the convicted individual. Death was reserved for the most serious offences, but it could be administered through dozens of different methods, each carrying its own symbolic meaning and level of suffering. Beheading was considered a noble death, reserved for aristocrats and others of high social standing. It was intended to be quick and relatively painless, though the reality often fell short of the intention. Executioners required considerable skill to sever a head cleanly with a single blow, and botched executions were common enough that crowds would sometimes riot when forced to watch prolonged suffering. Hanging was the common method for ordinary criminals, but even this apparently simple execution method had numerous variations. Quick drop hanging, designed to break the neck and cause immediate death, required precise calculation of rope length, knot placement, and drop distance. More commonly, prisoners were subjected to slow strangulation, dancing at the end of the rope for several minutes before finally losing consciousness. Burning was reserved for heretics and witches, carrying profound religious symbolism about purification through fire. But even here, the reality was more complex than popular images suggest. Wealthy prisoners, or those with influential friends, might be secretly strangled before the flames reached them, sparing them the agony of burning alive. Others were burned over green wood that produced thick smoke, causing death by suffocation rather than burning. Drawing and quartering represented the ultimate punishment for treason, involving disembowelment while the prisoner was still alive, followed by dismemberment and public display of body parts. This wasn't just about causing maximum suffering. It was about completely destroying the physical body to prevent any possibility of resurrection or martyrdom. The public nature of most executions served multiple functions beyond simple deterrence. These spectacles reinforced social hierarchies by demonstrating the ultimate power of authority over individual life and death. They provide that had entertainment for populations D few other forms of public amusement. And they created collective participation in state violence that made entire communities complicit in the system of control. Execution crowds weren't passive observers. They were active participants who could influence the proceedings through their reactions. A sympathetic crowd might pressure executioners to show mercy or provide quick death. A hostile crowd might demand additional suffering or humiliation for unpopular prisoners. Executioners had to read crowd moods carefully and adjust their methods accordingly. The economics of medieval execution reveal another disturbing aspect of the system. Executioners were often paid per execution, creating financial incentives for them to carry out their duties efficiently and dramatically. They could supplement their income by selling pieces of rope, clothing, or other items associated with famous executions to souvenir hunters. The bodies of executed criminals became valuable commodities in their own right. Physicians and anatomists would pay substantial sums for fresh corpses to use in medical research and teaching. The of fat hanged criminals was believed to have medicinal properties and could be sold for significant amounts. Even the blood of executed individuals was collected and sold as a cure for epilepsy and other ailments. But not everyone who entered medieval dungeons was destined for execution. Many prisoners served terms of imprisonment that were intended to end with their release, assuming they survived the experience. These long-term prisoners developed their own subcultures within the dungeon system, creating informal hierarchies and support networks that helped them endure years or decades of confinement. The prisoner economy that developed in long-term detention facilities was surprisingly sophisticated. Inmates would trade food rations, clothing, information, and services according to complex exchange rates that reflected the relative scarcity of different commodities. Skilled craftsmen could earn better treatment by providing services to guards or wealthy fellow prisoners. Literate inmates could write letters or teach reading in exchange for protection or additional food. Female prisoners faced unique challenges and developed their own survival strategies. Women's prisons were often attached to monasteries or convents, where nuns served as guards and administrators. The religious environment was supposed to provide opportunities for spiritual rehabilitation, but it also created additional forms of psychological pressure through constant religious instruction and forced participation in religious services. The treatment of pregnant prisoners reveals some of the contradictions in medieval justice. Execution of pregnant women was generally forbidden until after they gave birth, leading to situations where condemned women would deliberately seek pregnancy to delay their executions. Children born in prison were sometimes raised within the prison system, creating generations of individuals who knew no other life than confinement. The medical care available to medieval prisoners was minimal, but not entirely absent. Some larger prisons employed physicians who would treat serious injuries and illnesses, not out of humanitarian concern, but to keep prisoners alive long enough to serve their sentences or face execution. These prison doctors developed expertise in treating malnutrition, infectious diseases, and injuries that were common in dungeon environments. Religious care for prisoners was more consistently available than medical care, with chaplains or monks regularly visiting prisons to provide last rites, hear confessions, and offer spiritual counseling. This religious attention wasn't purely altruistic. It served the important function of encouraging prisoners to accept their punishment as divinely ordained, and to face death with resignation rather than rebellion. The record-keeping associated with medieval prisons was often meticulous, with detailed logs of prisoner arrivals, departures, punishments, and deaths administrative. These records serve functions, helping authorities track the disposition of cases and manage prison populations. But they also served as historical documents that provide modern researchers with detailed insights into the operation of medieval justice systems. Some of these records reveal unexpected aspects of prison life, including instances of mercy, clemency, and humanitarian concern that contradict the image of medieval justice as uniformly brutal. Prisoners might be released early for good behavior, have their sentences commuted due to political changes, or receive pardons from monarchs seeking to demonstrate royal mercy on religious holidays. The Christmas and Easter pardons that became traditional in many European kingdoms represented institutionalized mercy that provided hope for prisoners and demonstrated the Christian virtues of their rulers. These pardons were carefully orchestrated political events that served multiple purposes, showing royal benevolence, reducing prison populations, and providing opportunities for political reconciliation. But for every story of mercy and release, there were countless others of prisoners who simply disappeared into the dungeon system, their fates unknown to family and friends. The bureaucracy of medieval justice was efficient at processing people into the system, but far less reliable at tracking what happened to them afterward. The letters and messages that prisoners managed to smuggle out of medieval dungeons provide some of the most poignant evidence of life behind bars. These desperate communications reveal the human cost of medieval justice, the families destroyed by imprisonment, the communities torn apart by accusations and arrests, and the individual suffering that lay behind the administrative records and legal procedures. The reality of medieval prisoner communication networks was far more sophisticated than authorities realized. Despite the isolation and surveillance, prisoners developed intricate systems for passing information throughout dungeon complexes. Messages would be scratched into stone walls using fingernails or small pieces of metal, creating a primitive but effective communication system that could span multiple cells and even different levels of a prison. These wall messages weren't random graffiti. They followed specific codes and placement patterns that allowed prisoners to share crucial information about guard rotations, upcoming executions, or planned escapes. New prisoners would be taught these communication systems by veterans who had survived months or years in confinement. The walls themselves became libraries of survival knowledge, passed down through generations of inmates. But perhaps the most ingenious communication method involved the use of rats. Prisoners discovered they could train these vermin to carry small objects between cells by baiting specific routes with food scraps. Tiny scrolls, carved tokens, or even small tools could be transported through the dungeon's ventilation systems and drainage channels by creatures that moved freely through spaces humans couldn't access. The guards eventually caught on to some of these communication networks, leading to increasingly brutal crackdowns on any form of prisoner cooperation. Cells would be searched regularly for hidden messages. Prisoners would be moved frequently to prevent them from establishing communication patterns, and severe punishments would be imposed on anyone caught attempting to share information. These communication crackdowns reveal something important about the psychology of medieval imprisonment. The authorities understood that isolation was one of their most powerful weapons. A prisoner who could communicate with others maintained some sense of human connection and dignity. A prisoner cut off from all contact gradually lost their grip on reality and became much easier of family to control. The roll members in the medieval prison system adds another layer of complexity to this dark history. Unlike modern incarceration, medieval imprisonment often involved entire family networks in ways that seem almost impossible to comprehend today. When someone was arrested for heresy or treason, their relatives would often be detained as well, either as suspected accomplices or as leverage to ensure cooperation from the primary prisoner. Children of imprisoned parents faced particularly tragic circumstances. Some would be placed in monastery orphanages where they'd be raised to believe their parents were evil criminals deserving of punishment. Others would be sold into slavery or indentured servitude to pay for their parents' imprisonment costs. The lucky ones might be taken in by relatives, but even then, they're the stigma of their family's disgrace for the rest of their lives. Wives of imprisoned men found themselves in impossible situations. They might be accused of complicity in their husband's crimes, stripped of property and social standing, and left to survive however they could. Some would remarry quickly to escape destitution, effectively abandoning their imprisoned spouses. Others would spend years trying to secure their husband's release, selling everything they owned to pay bribe fees. The visiting bees, or legal systems in medieval prisons, were designed to maximize psychological pressure on both prisoners and their families. Visits were rare, heavily supervised, and often used as opportunities for additional interrogation. Family members might be questioned about the prisoner's activities, asked to provide information that could be used against them, or pressured to convince their loved ones to confess. These visits could be more psychologically damaging than helpful. Seeing family members in distress, witnessing their financial struggles, or learning about the social ostracism they faced because of the imprisonment often broke prisoners' spirits more effectively than any torture device. The knowledge that their incarceration was destroying innocent created people guilt and despair that authorities exploited ruthlessly. The seasonal rhythms of medieval prison life reflected the broader agricultural calendar that governed all aspects of medieval society. Winter months were particularly brutal for prisoners as food became scarcer, fuel for heating was rationed, and the cold stone walls made already uncomfortable cells nearly uninhabitable. Many prisoners who survived the initial trauma of arrest would succumb to hypothermia during their first winter in captivity. Spring brought its own challenges, as lasting snow and seasonal rains would flood lower-level cells, forcing prisoners to stand in rising water for days or weeks until drainage systems could cope with the influx. The combination of cold water, poor nutrition, and existing injuries created ideal conditions for disease outbreaks that could sweep through entire prison populations. Summer heat made the already stifling air in poorly ventilated dungeons nearly unbearable. The combination of human waste, rotting food, and decomposing bodies created toxic atmospheres that would literally poison prisoners. Those fortunate enough to survive summer in underground cells often emerged permanently damaged by the poisonous air they'd been forced to breathe. Autumn was considered the best season for imprisonment, with moderate temperatures and the harvest season providing slightly better food supplies. But autumn also marked the traditional time for mass executions, as authorities sought to clear prison populations before winter made maintaining them more expensive and difficult. The diet provided to medieval prisoners reveals the calculated nature of their mistreatment. Food wasn't just scarce, it was deliberately inadequate, designed to keep prisoners weak but alive. The standard ration was often nothing more than bread and water, but even this meagre allowance was frequently contaminated or spoiled. Bread given to prisoners was typically made from the cheapest available ingredients, often including sawdust, sand, or other inedible materials to stretch the flour. This bread was deliberately baked to be as hard as possible, making it difficult to eat and digest. Prisoners with dental problems, which were common due to poor nutrition and lack of medical care, might starve even when food was technically available. Water supplies were another tool of control and punishment. Clean water was a luxury that prisoners rarely enjoyed. Instead, they'd be given stagnant water from cisterns or wells that had been contaminated with waste or deliberately fouled to make it barely drinkable. The constant threat of waterborne diseases added another layer of suffering to the prison experience. Some prisoners received supplemental food from family members or sympathetic guards, but these extras came at a cost. Families might bankrupt themselves trying to keep imprisoned relatives, selling alive propertied possessions to purchase and food that would often be stolen by guards before reaching its intended recipient. The corruption permeated medieval prison systems extended far beyond simple bribery. Guards, administrators, and even religious officials created elaborate schemes to profit from human misery. Food intended for prisoners would be sold in local markets, with inmates receiving only a fraction of what had been allocated for their care. Medical supplies, clothing, and fuel for heating were all subject to similar theft and resale. The result was a system where the theoretical provisions for prisoner care existed on paper but rarely reached the people who needed them. Prisoners' suffering was literally being converted into profit for those charged with their care. Some guards developed particularly creative forms of corruption. They might offer to carry messages between prisoners and their families, charging substantial fees for this service, while sometimes delivering false information designed to increase despair. Others would sell information about planned executions or transfers, allowing wealthy prisoners to prepare final arrangements while leaving poor prisoners in ignorance. The religious corruption within medieval prison systems was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of institutional duct. Miscon chaplains and monks, who were supposed to provide spiritual comfort, often used their access to prisoners for personal gain. They might demand payment for religious services, sell false indulgences, or even participate in torture sessions by providing theological justification for the suffering they witnessed. Some religious officials developed elaborate schemes involving false prophecies or divine visions that they would sell to desperate prisoners. A monk might claim to have received a revelation about a prisoner's innocence, then demand payment to share this information with authorities. Others would promise to intercede with God on behalf of prisoners, collecting fees for prayers that were never offered. The legal appeals was the process in medieval justice ethically available to prisoners, but in practice, it was designed to extract additional money rather than provide genuine recourse. Prisoners could petition for review of their cases, but these appeals required payment of substantial fees at every level of the bureaucracy. Court scribes charged for writing appeals, messengers demanded payment for delivering them, and judges expected bribes before they would even consider reviewing cases. The result was a system where appeals were only available to the wealthy, while poor prisoners had no recourse regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Even when appeals were successful, the relief they provided was often minimal. A prisoner might have reduced from their sentenced death to life imprisonment, or from torture to simple incarceration. These technical victories did little to improve the actual conditions of imprisonment, but did provide hope that could be exploited by corrupt officials seeking additional payments. The international dimension of medieval imprisonment reveals how justice systems across Europe shared information. Prisoners who and techniques escaped from one kingdom might find themselves pursued across borders by networks of law enforcement officials who shared intelligence about fugitives and criminals. The Holy Roman Empire maintained extensive records of political prisoners and religious dissidents, sharing this information with other Christian kingdoms to prevent escape and exile. Someone condemned for heresy in France might find themselves arrested in England based on information provided by French authorities. This international cooperation extended to the sharing of torture techniques and interrogation methods. Inquisitors from different countries would correspond about effective procedures, successful interrogations, and innovations in prisoner control. What we might consider medieval war crimes were actually the subject discussion of scholarly and professional development among justice officials. The diplomatic implications of prisoner treatment occasionally led to international incidents. When important prisoners were citizens of foreign kingdoms, their treatment could affect relations between nations. The imprisonment and execution of foreign merchants, diplomats, or nobles could lead to trade disputes, diplomatic protests, or even military conflicts. Some prisoners became pawns in larger political games, with their treatment deliberately designed to send messages to foreign powers. A harsh sentence for a foreign merchant might be intended to pressure his home country in trade negotiations. Lenient treatment of a captured enemy soldier might signal a desire for peace talks. The economics of medieval imprisonment extended far beyond the simple costs of food and shelter. Prisons were economic institutions that generated revenue through various forms of exploitation. Prisoners could be forced to work in workshops, mines, or construction projects, with their labour sold to private contractors or used for public works projects. Skilled craftsmen among the prisoner population were particularly valuable, as they could produce goods that would be sold for profit while receiving minimal compensation for their work. Blacksmiths, carpenters, and textile workers might find their skills in high demand, leading to slightly better treatment, but also increased exploitation. The property of condemned prisoners was subject to confiscation, creating powerful incentives for authorities to pursue cases against wealthy individuals regardless of their actual guilt. The promise of seizing substantial estates, valuable goods, or commercial enterprises could influence decisions about who to arrest and what charges to pursue. Some medieval kingdoms developed sophisticated systems for managing confiscated property, with specialized officials responsible for inventorying, maintaining, and selling goods seized from prisoners. These officials often became wealthy through their positions, skimming profits and manipulating valuations to their advantage. The impact of medieval imprisonment on broader society extended far beyond the immediate victims. Communities would be devastated by the loss of skilled workers, community leaders, or simply large numbers of working-age adults. The social fabric of villages and towns could be permanently damaged by mass arrests or high-profile imprisonments. The fear of imprisonment also served as a powerful tool of social control. People would modify their behavior limit their associations, and avoid expressing controversial opinions out of fear that they might be denounced and arrested. This climate of fear was often more effective than actual imprisonment in maintaining order and suppressing dissent. Children growing up in communities where imprisonment was common would internalize these fears and constraints from an early age. They would learn to be suspicious of neighbors, careful about their words, and accepting of authority justice of its regardless or legitimacy. The psychological impact of medieval justice systems extended across generations through these learned behaviors and attitudes. The merchant classes were particularly affected by the unpredictability of medieval justice. Commercial success could attract unwanted attention from authorities seeking to confiscate wealth, while business disputes could escalate into criminal accusations. The lack of reliable legal protections meant that economic prosperity was always precarious and dependent on political favor. Artisan guilds developed their own systems for protecting members from arbitrary arrest and imprisonment. These organizations would maintain legal funds to pay for appeals and bribes, provide support for families of imprisoned members, and negotiate with authorities for better treatment of their colleagues. The guild system became a crucial buffer between individual craftsmen and the harsh realities of medieval justice. The seasonal patterns of imprisonment and execution reflected broader economic and political cycles. Harvest time might bring mass arrests of peasants accused of theft or rebellion. Religious holidays would see waves of prosecutions for heresy or blasphemy. Political transitions would trigger purges of officials previous from administrations. These cyclical patterns meant that medieval prisons experienced dramatic fluctuations in population that strained their limited resources and infrastructure. Overcrowding during peak periods would lead to even conditions than worse normal, while periods of lower occupancy might provide slight relief for surviving prisoners. The architectural evolution of medieval prisons reflects changing approaches to punishment and control. Early medieval detention facilities were often simple modifications of existing structures with little specialized design for imprisonment. Over time, architects developed increasingly sophisticated understanding of how physical environment could be used to psychological control and punishment. The gradual shift from public punishment toward private imprisonment represents one of the major transitions in medieval justice. Early medieval justice emphasized public spectacle and community participation in punishment. Later medieval systems increasingly moved toward hidden bureaucratic forms of control that were more efficient but also more terrifying in their impersonal systematic nature. These architectural innovations weren't limited to royal or noble prisons. Church institutions, merchant guilds, and even municipal governments developed their own specialized detention facilities, designed for their particular needs and populations. The proliferation of prison construction across medieval Europe represents a major investment of resources and a fundamental shift in approaches to social control. The preservation of medieval prison architecture provides modern archaeologists and historians with invaluable insights into the practical realities of medieval justice. Excavations of dungeon sites reveal evidence of living conditions, population densities, and daily routines that aren't captured in official records or literary accounts. Physical evidence from medieval prison sites often contradicts official accounts of prisoner treatment and conditions. Archaeological findings reveal malnutrition, violence, and overcrowding that official records minimize or ignore entirely. The bones and artifacts found in medieval prison excavations tell stories of suffering that were deliberately obscured by contemporary authorities. These archaeological discoveries continue to reshape our understanding of medieval justice and society. Each excavation reveals new details about the lived experience of imprisonment and the systematic nature of medieval oppression. The physical evidence provides a powerful counterbalance to official histories that often minimize the brutality of medieval justice systems. The international scholars who study medieval imprisonment bring diverse perspectives and methodologies to understanding this dark chapter of human history. Their work reveals both the universal aspects of human cruelty and the specific cultural and religious factors that shaped medieval approaches to punishment and control. Modern research into medieval imprisonment serves important functions beyond simple historical curiosity. Understanding how systematic oppression functioned in the past provides insights into recognizing and preventing similar systems in the present. The mechanisms of control, the bureaucratic structures, and the psychological techniques developed in medieval prisons have echoes in modern authoritarian systems. The study of medieval dungeons also reveals the remarkable resilience and creativity of human beings under even the most oppressive conditions. The communication networks, escape attempts, and survival strategies developed by medieval prisoners demonstrate the fundamental human drive toward freedom and dignity that no system of control can completely suppress. But perhaps the most important lesson from studying medieval imprisonment is understanding how ordinary people can become complicit in systematic cruelty. The guards, administrators, and officials who operated medieval prisons weren't monsters. They were regular people, operating within systems that normalized and rewarded brutality. Their example serves as a warning about how quickly civilized societies can descend into barbarism when proper safeguards and moral restraints are abandoned. The documentary evidence that survives from medieval prisons provides chilling insights into the bureaucratic nature of systematic oppression. Prison registers, execution lists, and administrative correspondence reveal how thoroughly normalized violence and cruelty had become within medieval justice systems. These documents show that brutality wasn't the result of individual sadism, but of institutional structures that rewarded cruel efficiency and punished mercy or compassion. The legacy of medieval prisons extends far beyond their stone walls and rusted chains. These institutions fundamentally shaped how Western civilization thinks about crime, punishment, and justice. But to understand their true impact, we need to examine the specific cases that became legendary, the prisoners whose names echo through history, and the ways these dark chapters influenced everything that came after. Let's start with the Tower of London, perhaps the most famous prison in medieval Europe. Built by William the Conqueror after 1066, the tower wasn't originally designed as a prison at all. It was a royal residence, a fortress, a treasury, and a symbol of Norman power over the conquered English. But its transformation into England's most notorious prison reveals how medieval authorities adapted existing structures to serve their expanding need for secure detention facilities. The Tower's first political prisoner was Bishop Ranulph Flambard in 1100, who had the distinction of also being its first escapee. Flambard managed to flee by climbing down a rope smuggled to him in a wine cask, demonstrating that even the most secure medieval fortifications had vulnerabilities that clever prisoners could exploit. His escape set a precedent that would inspire countless other attempts over the centuries. But it was the Tower's role during the Tudor period that cemented its reputation as a place of terror. Henry VIII's reign transformed the fortress into a factory of judicial murder, where some of England's most prominent figures met their end. The cases of Anne Boleyn, Catherine Howard, Thomas More, and Thomas Cromwell reveal how medieval prison systems evolved to serve the political needs of increasingly centralized monarchies. Anne Boleyn's imprisonment and execution in 1536 demonstrates the intersection of personal vendetta and state power that characterized late medieval justice. Confined in the same apartments she had occupied as queen, Boleyn experienced the psychological torture of dramatic reversal that was often more devastating than physical abuse. Her guards reported that she swung between hysterical laughter and desperate weeping, showing the mental breakdown that medieval authorities deliberately cultivated in their most important prisoners. The specific charges against Boleyn, adultery, treason, and incest, were almost certainly fabricated, but they served Henry's political needs perfectly. The legal proceedings that condemned her followed proper forms and procedures, demonstrating how medieval justice systems could produce predetermined outcomes while maintaining the appearance of a legitimate process. Her execution drew massive crowds who came to witness the spectacle of royal justice in action. Thomas More's imprisonment reveals different aspects of medieval political detention. Unlike Boleyn, More was genuinely guilty of the charges against him by the standards of his time. He had refused to acknowledge Henry's supremacy over the English Church, making him technically guilty of treason under newly enacted laws. His case shows how medieval legal systems could be used to criminalize previously acceptable behavior through retroactive legislation. More's 15 months in the Tower were marked by intellectual resistance rather than attempts at physical escape. He continued writing religious and philosophical works, smuggling manuscripts out through visitors and sympathetic guards. His letters from prison reveal the mental strategies that educated prisoners used to maintain their sanity and dignity under extreme duress. The Tower's Bloody Tower earned its sinister reputation through the mysterious disappearance of the two young princes, Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, in 1483. While their fate remains officially unknown, the popular belief that they were murdered on Richard's orders illustrates how medieval prisons became associated with crimes that went far beyond judicial punishment. The prince's case vulnerability reveals the of child prisoners in medieval detention systems. Children of political enemies were often held as hostages to ensure their parents' cooperation or as bargaining chips in diplomatic negotiations. Their treatment ranged from relatively comfortable house arrest to conditions indistinguishable from adult prisoners, depending entirely on their political value and the whims of their captors. Moving across the English Channel, the Bastille in Paris represents another evolution in medieval prison architecture and function. Originally built as a fortress in the 14th century, the Bastille became synonymous with royal oppression and arbitrary imprisonment. Unlike the Tower of London, which served multiple functions, the Bastille was primarily designed for political detention from its early years. The Bastille's most famous feature was its lettres de cachet, sealed orders from the king that could imprison anyone indefinitely without trial or formal charges. These documents represent the ultimate expression of absolute royal power over individual liberty. Families could even request lettres de cachet against their own members, using royal authority to resolve private disputes or control rebellious relatives. The Man in the Iron Mask, probably the most mysterious prisoner in European history, spent decades in various French prisons, including the Bastille. His identity remains unknown, but his treatment reveals important aspects of how medieval authorities handled politically sensitive prisoners. The elaborate precautions taken to conceal his identity, including the famous mask, show the lengths to which governments would go to protect state secrets. Recent historical research suggests the masked prisoner was probably Eustache d'Auger, a valet who had become privy to sensitive information about high-ranking officials. His case illustrates how medieval prison systems were used not just to punish crimes, but to suppress potentially embarrassing or dangerous knowledge. The mystery surrounding his identity was deliberately cultivated by authorities who understood that speculation and fear were often more effective than verified facts. The Bastille's prisoners included many prominent literary and intellectual figures whose works provide invaluable first-hand accounts of prison conditions. Voltaire's imprisonment there in 1717 influenced his lifelong campaign for judicial reform and religious tolerance. His letters describe the arbitrary nature of his confinement and the psychological impact of indefinite detention without formal charges. The Marquis de Sade's multiple imprisonments in various French prisons, including the Bastille, produced some of the most detailed accounts of prison life available from the medieval period. His descriptions of daily routines, guard behaviors, and prisoner interactions provide insights that official records deliberately obscure. While Sade's reliability as a narrator is questionable, his accounts capture the lived experience of long-term imprisonment in ways that administrative documents cannot. Italian prisons during the medieval period developed their own distinctive characteristics, influenced by the complex political landscape of competing city-states, papal territories, and foreign occupations. The Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome served multiple functions as papal residence, fortress, and prison, creating unique dynamics between religious and secular authority. The Castel Sant'Angelo's most famous prisoner was Benvenuto Cellini, the Renaissance artist and goldsmith, who provided one of the most vivid accounts of prison escape in medieval literature. Cellini's 1538 breakout involved climbing down bedsheets from the castle's highest tower, breaking his leg in the fall, then crawling to safety despite his injuries. His detailed description of the escape reveals both the ingenuity required for such attempts and the brutal consequences faced by those who were recaptured. Cellini's account also provides insights into the corruption that permeated medieval prison systems. He describes bribing guards, negotiating for better food and accommodations, and using his artistic skills to gain favorable treatment from prison officials. His experience shows how wealth, talent, and social connections could significantly improve a prisoner's conditions, even in the most secure facilities. The Doge's Palace in Venice contained prisons that were considered among the most escape-proof in medieval Europe. The famous Bridge of Sighs connected the interrogation rooms in the palace to the detention cells across the canal, creating a system where prisoners could be moved without any possibility of rescue or escape. The bridge's name reflects the despair of prisoners who crossed it, knowing they might never return. Venice's prison system was notable for its bureaucratic efficiency and systematic record-keeping. The Venetian archives contain thousands of documents detailing individual cases, prison conditions, and administrative procedures that provide modern historians with unprecedented insights into the daily operation of medieval detention facilities. These records reveal both the sophisticated organization of Venetian justice and the systematic nature of its oppression. The famous escape of Giacomo Casanova from the Doge's Palace prisons in 1756 demonstrates the continuing evolution of prison security and prisoner ingenuity. Casanova's account of his escape, involving months of preparation, careful study of guard routines, and elaborate deception, reads like a modern thriller, but provides valuable historical evidence about prison conditions and security measures. German prisons during the medieval period were shaped by the complex political structure of the Holy Roman Empire, with numerous independent territories maintaining their own justice systems. The Nuremberg trials, centuries before the famous 20th century proceedings, established important precedents for international criminal justice and the treatment of prisoners of war. The executioner, Franz Schmidt, whose detailed diary we discussed earlier, provides unique insights into the practical aspects of medieval criminal justice. Schmidt's records show that execution was often considered a more merciful sentence than long-term imprisonment, revealing medieval attitudes toward punishment that seem alien to modern sensibilities. Schmidt's diary also reveals the seasonal rhythms of medieval justice, with executions clustered around major religious holidays, when large crowds could witness the spectacle. His meticulous records of different execution methods show the systematic approach that medieval authorities took toward public punishment and deterrence. The castle prison at Wartburg in Germany became famous for its association with Martin Luther, who was held there in protective custody rather than punishment. Luther's imprisonment reveals another function of medieval prisons as places of refuge for politically controversial figures. His productive literary work during confinement shows how some prisoners used their detention as opportunities for intellectual development, rather than simply enduring suffering. The spread of printing technology during the late medieval period created new challenges for prison administrators. Prisoners who could write might produce works that could be secretly printed and distributed, spreading their ideas far beyond the prison walls. This technological development forced authorities to develop new forms of censorship and surveillance that extended their control beyond simple physical confinement. The role of women in medieval prisons deserves special attention because their experiences were shaped by gender expectations and vulnerabilities that male prisoners didn't face. Women's prisons were often attached to religious institutions, where nuns served as guards and administrators. This created complex dynamics between spiritual authority and temporal punishment that influenced every aspect of female prisoners' experiences. Joan of Arc's imprisonment and trial represent perhaps the most famous case of a woman political prisoner in medieval Europe. Her treatment reveals how gender stereotypes could be manipulated to discredit female prisoners and justify their punishment. The charges of witchcraft and heresy brought against her were specifically designed to attack her credibility as a woman claiming divine authority. Joan's insistence on wearing male clothing during her imprisonment became a central issue in her trial, showing how medieval authorities used gender nonconformity as evidence of spiritual corruption. Her eventual execution demonstrated the particular vulnerabilities faced by women who challenged traditional gender roles and social hierarchies. The persecution of alleged witches during the late medieval period created a specialized category of female prisoners whose treatment was governed by specific legal procedures and theological assumptions. The Malleus Maleficarum and similar texts provided detailed instructions for the imprisonment and interrogation of accused witches, creating standardized procedures that were applied across much of Europe. Women accused of witchcraft faced unique forms of psychological torture designed to exploit female-specific fears and vulnerabilities. Strip searches, public humiliation, and threats against their children were commonly used to extract confessions. The assumption that women were more susceptible to diabolic influence shaped every aspect of their treatment in prison. The economic impact of witch trials on medieval communities was substantial, as the property of convicted witches was subject to confiscation. This created powerful financial incentives for authorities to pursue witchcraft cases, especially against wealthy women whose assets could significantly benefit local governments or church institutions. The gradual decline of witch trials during the later Attitudes medieval period reflects changing intellectual and legal procedures rather than increased tolerance or humanity. The rise of more sophisticated legal standards of evidence made it harder to convict people based purely on spectral evidence or forced confessions obtained through torture. Children in medieval prisons faced unique challenges that modern people find particularly difficult to understand or accept. The legal concept of childhood as a distinct category with special protections didn't exist in medieval law, meaning that children could be tried and punished as adults for serious crimes. The treatment of child prisoners varied enormously depending on their social status, the nature of their alleged crimes, and the political circumstances of their cases. Royal children held as political hostages might live in relative comfort while awaiting ransom or political resolution. Peasant children accused of theft might face the same brutal conditions as adult criminals. Educational opportunities for imprisoned children were rare but not unknown. Some religious institutions that operated prisons provided basic literacy instruction as part of their spiritual these. Mission educational programs were designed to produce compliant subjects rather than critical thinkers. But they did provide some children with intellectual tools that they might not have acquired otherwise. The psychological impact of imprisonment on children was recognized by some medieval authorities, though this awareness didn't necessarily translate into more humane treatment. Children were seen as more malleable than adults, making them potentially valuable subjects for intensive religious indoctrination or political conversion. The international dimensions of medieval imprisonment become clear when we examine cases of diplomatic hostages and prisoners of war. The complex web of political alliances and enmities that characterized medieval Europe meant that prisoners were often held in foreign countries, creating diplomatic complications that could affect relations between nations for decades. The treatment of foreign prisoners was governed by informal diplomatic protocols that balanced the desire for harsh punishment against the need to maintain international relationships. A king who treated enemy prisoners too brutally might find his own subjects facing similar treatment when they were captured abroad. The exchange of high-value prisoners became a regular feature of medieval diplomacy, with elaborate negotiations determining the terms and timing of releases. These prisoner exchanges reveal the political value that medieval authorities placed on specific individuals and the complex calculations that governed international relations. The development of formal diplomatic immunity during the late medieval period was partly driven by the need to protect envoys and ambassadors from arbitrary imprisonment. The recognition that diplomatic representatives should be immune from local criminal prosecution represented an important evolution in international law and the treatment of foreign nationals. The economic costs of maintaining large prison populations created ongoing fiscal challenges for medieval governments. The expense of feeding, guarding, and housing prisoners had to be balanced against the political benefits of detention and the revenue generated through confiscation of prisoners' property. Some medieval authorities experimented with making prisons self-supporting through prisoner labour or fees charged to prisoners' families. These economic innovations created new forms of exploitation, but also provided incentives for authorities to keep prisoners alive and productive, rather than simply allowing them to die in custody. The development of private prisons during the later medieval period represented an early form of privatized punishment that created profit incentives around human suffering. Private prison operators were paid fixed amounts per prisoner, creating financial motivations to minimize costs and maximize capacity regardless of the impact on prisoner welfare. The regulation of private prisons was minimal, leading to abuses that exceeded even the harsh standards of government-operated facilities. The profit motive, combined with minimal oversight, created conditions where systematic torture and exploitation became normalized business practices. The technological innovations that emerged from medieval prison systems had lasting impacts on architecture, engineering, and security systems. The specialized locks, reinforced doors, and surveillance techniques developed for prisons were later adapted for other purposes, including banks, treasuries, and military fortifications. The psychological insights gained from observing prisoner behavior under extreme stress influenced medieval understanding of human nature and social control. The systematic study of how people respond to imprisonment, isolation, and torture provided knowledge that was applied to other areas of government and social management. The legal precedents established through medieval prison cases continue to influence modern legal systems in ways that most people don't recognize. The procedures for handling confessions obtained under duress, the rights of prisoners to legal representation, and the standards for evidence in criminal cases all have roots in medieval legal developments. The architectural legacy of medieval prisons extends beyond their historical significance to influence modern prison design and security systems. The principles of isolation, surveillance, and control that were pioneered in medieval dungeons continue to shape contemporary approaches to incarceration and punishment. The literature and art inspired by medieval prisons have had profound cultural impacts that extend far beyond their historical period. The Gothic novels, romantic poems, and dramatic works that drew inspiration from medieval prison stories helped shape modern attitudes toward justice, authority, and individual rights. The psychological understanding of trauma, isolation, and systematic oppression that emerged from studying medieval prison experiences has contributed to modern therapeutic approaches and human rights advocacy. The recognition that certain forms of treatment constitute torture, regardless of their legal authorization, has roots in medieval experiences and documentation. The comparative study of medieval prison systems across different European countries reveals important patterns in the development of state power and social control. The similarities in prison architecture, interrogation techniques, and administrative procedures show how knowledge and practices spread across political boundaries through professional networks and institutional learning. The religious dimensions of medieval imprisonment continue to influence modern debates about the role of faith in criminal justice and prison reform. The tension between punishment and redemption that characterized medieval religious approaches to imprisonment remains relevant to contemporary discussions about rehabilitation versus retribution. The medical knowledge that emerged from treating prisoners under extreme conditions contributed to medieval understanding of disease, malnutrition, and the effects of stress on human health. The systematic documentation of prisoner mortality and morbidity provided early examples of epidemiological research that influenced broader medical practice. The social impact of mass imprisonment on medieval communities provides historical context for modern concerns about incarceration rates and their effects on families and neighborhoods. The disruption of community structures, economic relationships, and social networks caused by medieval imprisonment campaigns offers lessons that remain relevant today. The bureaucratic innovations developed to manage large prison populations influenced broader administrative practices in medieval government. The record-keeping systems, classification procedures, and resource management techniques pioneered in prisons were later applied to other areas of public administration. The resistance movements that emerged in response to medieval prison systems established important precedents for organized opposition to state oppression. The communication networks, mutual aid societies, and advocacy organizations that developed to support prisoners and their families provided models for later human rights movements. The international legal principles that gradually emerged from medieval experiences with cross-border imprisonment and diplomatic detention laid groundwork for modern international law and human rights protections. The recognition that certain treatment of prisoners violates universal standards, regardless of local law, represents an important evolution from medieval practices. The technological arms race between prison security systems and escape techniques that characterized medieval imprisonment continues to influence modern corrections and security industries. The constant adaptation of containment methods to counter prisoner innovations establish patterns that persist in contemporary prison management. The economic analysis of medieval prison systems reveals important insights about the relationship between punishment and profit that remain relevant to modern debates about private prisons and the commercialization of criminal justice. The historical evidence shows how financial incentives can distort justice systems in ways that increase rather than reduce crime and social disorder. The gender analysis of medieval prison experiences provides historical context for modern concerns about the differential treatment of male and female prisoners. The documentation of systematic abuse and exploitation of women in medieval prisons helped establish precedents for gender-specific protections in modern correctional systems. The study of child prisoners in medieval systems offers disturbing historical perspective on contemporary debates about juvenile justice and the treatment of minors in adult criminal justice systems. The medieval evidence demonstrates the long-term social costs of treating children as adult criminals and the importance of age-appropriate interventions. The psychiatric insights that emerged from medieval observations of prisoner behavior under extreme stress contributed to early understanding of mental illness, trauma responses, and the psychological effects of social isolation. These observations provided foundational knowledge that influenced the development of modern psychology and psychiatry. The architectural preservation of medieval prison sites serves important educational and memorial functions that help contemporary societies understand the historical development of justice systems and human rights protections. These preserved sites provide tangible connections to historical experiences that might otherwise remain abstract or theoretical. The ongoing archaeological investigation of medieval prison sites continues to reveal new information about historical conditions, prison, and prisoner experiences. The physical evidence uncovered through systematic excavation often contradicts official historical records, provides more and accurate pictures of medieval justice practices. The international scholarly collaboration that has developed around medieval prison studies demonstrates the global relevance of these historical experiences and their continued importance for understanding contemporary justice systems. The cross-cultural comparative research reveals both universal patterns in human responses to oppression and specific cultural factors that shaped different prison systems. The educational curricula that have emerged from medieval prison studies provide important tools for teaching about human rights, social justice, and the historical development of legal systems. The concrete historical examples help students understand abstract principles and connect historical experiences to contemporary issues. The policy implications of medieval prison research extend beyond academic interest to influence contemporary debates about criminal justice reform, rights protection, and the prevention of systematic oppression. The historical evidence provides powerful arguments for maintaining legal protections and institutional safeguards that prevent the recurrence of medieval-style abuses. But perhaps the most important lesson from our journey through medieval dungeons isn't about the past at all. It's about recognizing the fragility of the human rights protections we often take for granted today. The systematic cruelty of medieval prisons wasn't the result of primitive ignorance or exceptional evil. It emerged from the same human tendencies toward power abuse, bureaucratic indifference, and moral compromise that exist in every society. The guards who tortured prisoners, the judges who condemned innocents, and the officials who profited from human suffering were ordinary people operating within systems that normalized and rewarded cruelty. They weren't monsters. They were neighbors, family members, and respected community leaders who had gradually accepted that systematic oppression was necessary, inevitable, and even virtuous. The transformation of medieval societies from brutal prison states to more humane justice systems didn't happen automatically or inevitably. It required constant vigilance, sustained advocacy, and the courage of individuals who refused to accept that cruelty was normal or necessary. The human rights protections we enjoy today exist because previous generations fought against systems that seemed as permanent and unshakable as medieval dungeons once appeared. The stone walls of medieval prisons have crumbled, but the human capacity for both cruelty and resistance that they contained remains unchanged. Understanding this dark chapter of our shared history isn't just academic exercise. It's preparation for recognizing and opposing similar systems whenever and wherever they emerge. The echoes of medieval dungeons still resonate in contemporary justice systems, immigration detention facilities, and authoritarian governments around the world. The techniques of systematic dehumanization, bureaucratic cruelty, and psychological manipulation pioneered in medieval prisons continue to appear in new forms adapted to modern circumstances. But the stories of resistance, escape, and survival that emerged from medieval prisons also provide inspiration and practical knowledge for contemporary human rights advocates. The communication networks, mutual support systems, and strategic thinking that medieval prisoners developed remain relevant tools for opposing oppression in any era. The ultimate legacy of medieval dungeons isn't their architectural remains or historical documentation. It's the hard-won understanding that human dignity is fragile, that systematic oppression is always possible, and that protecting individual rights requires constant vigilance from every member of society. Tonight we've descended into some of the darkest chapters of human history, exploring places where civilization's veneer stripped away to reveal the capacity for systematic cruelty that lurks within seemingly normal societies. These weren't distant nightmares from an alien culture. They were institutions created by people fundamentally similar to ourselves, operating under pressures and incentives that still exist today. The medieval dungeon represents more than historical curiosity. It stands as a warning about how quickly human societies can descend into barbarism when proper safeguards are abandoned, when individual rights are subordinated to state power, and when ordinary people become complicit in systematic oppression through indifference, fear, or personal advantage. But our journey through these underground chambers of terror also reveals the remarkable resilience of human dignity under even the most oppressive conditions. The prisoners who maintained their sanity, who helped their fellow inmates, who risked everything for the possibility of freedom, remind us that the human spirit cannot be completely broken, no matter how sophisticated the systems designed to destroy it. The communication networks they built, the escape attempts they planned, the resistance movements they created, all demonstrate that hope and human connection can survive in the darkest places. Their example provides both inspiration and practical knowledge for recognizing and opposing oppression wherever it appears. As we emerge from this exploration of medieval dungeons, we carry with us not just knowledge of historical atrocities, but understanding struggle of the eternal between power and dignity, between systematic oppression and individual resistance, between the forces that would dehumanize us and our capacity to maintain our humanity, regardless of circumstances. The stone walls have crumbled, the iron chains have rusted away, but the lessons carved into those underground chambers remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. In every society, the choice between becoming a dungeon guard or standing with the prisoners presents itself anew. The medievals us that this dungeon remind choice matters, that individual decisions about complicity and resistance shape the character of entire civilizations, and that the price of human dignity is eternal vigilance against the forces that would strip it away. The darkness we've explored tonight runs deeper than stone and mortar. It seeps into the very foundations of how societies define justice, mercy, and the value of human life. But before we close this chapter on medieval dungeons, there's one more layer we need to peel back: the transformation itself. How did these chambers of systematic terror eventually give way to something resembling modern justice? And what does that evolution tell us about our own capacity for both progress and regression? The beginning of the end for medieval dungeon culture didn't come from sudden enlightenment or moral awakening. It emerged from the most practical of concerns: economics and efficiency. By the 14th century, maintaining vast prison populations was becoming financially unsustainable for most European kingdoms. The Black Death had decimated tax bases, while simultaneously creating labour shortages that made every able-bodied person economically valuable. Kings and nobles began to realise that keeping potential workers locked in dungeons was less profitable than putting them to productive use. This shift in thinking wasn't humanitarian. It was purely economic. A living peasant working in the fields generated more revenue than a dead prisoner rotting in a cell. This calculation would prove more powerful than centuries of moral arguments in driving prison reform. The rise of centralized nation-states also contributed to the decline of local dungeon systems. As monarchs consolidated power, they needed standardized legal procedures that could be applied consistently across their territories. The arbitrary justice of local lords and their private dungeons became obstacles to effective governance rather than tools of control. Professional legal systems began to emerge, staffed by trained lawyers and judges who understood that predictable legal outcomes were essential for stable commerce and taxation. These professionals had their own interests in creating systematic procedures that enhanced their status and authority. The random brutality of dungeon justice threatened their professional monopoly over legal expertise. The printing press revolution of the 15th century played a crucial role in dungeon reform by making legal texts widely available and standardizing legal procedures across different regions. When legal scholars could compare practices across Europe, the most extreme abuses became harder to justify or ignore. Written legal codes replaced local customs, creating expectations of consistent treatment that arbitrary dungeon justice couldn't meet. Religious reforms also contributed to changing attitudes toward imprisonment and torture. While the Church had initially sanctioned and participated in dungeon systems, growing theological sophistication led some religious thinkers to question whether systematic torture was compatible with Christian mercy. The Renaissance emphasis on individual dignity and human potential created intellectual frameworks for criticizing medieval prison practices. The Protestant Reformation accelerated these changes by challenging church authority and creating competing religious jurisdictions. Protestant territories often reform their justice systems specifically to differentiate themselves from Catholic practices, while Catholic regions responded with their own reforms to demonstrate moral superiority. But perhaps the most significant factor in dungeon decline was the changing nature of warfare and political control. Medieval dungeons were designed for a world where power was personal and local, where individual lords needed to demonstrate their authority through spectacular displays of violence. As warfare became more professional and political control more bureaucratic, these personal demonstrations of power became counterproductive. Standing armies and professional administrators could maintain order more effectively than fear-based systems that relied on spectacular punishment. The administrative apparatus needed for modern state governance required literate, skilled personnel who couldn't be easily replaced. Terrorizing potential civil servants into submission was less effective than creating incentive systems that rewarded loyalty and competence. The rise of international trade also put pressure on medieval justice systems. Merchants needed predictable legal environments where contracts would be enforced consistently and property rights protected reliably. The arbitrary nature of dungeon justice created too much uncertainty for complex commercial relationships to flourish. Italian city-states led the way in developing more sophisticated legal systems designed to support commercial activity. Venice, Florence, and Genoa created legal innovations that balanced the need for social control with the requirements of international commerce. Their success demonstrated that alternatives to medieval dungeon justice could be both more humane and more economically productive. The gradual professionalization of military forces also reduced reliance on terror-based control systems. Professional soldiers were more effective than conscripted peasants, but they required different management approaches. Military discipline based on training and esprit de corps replaced systems based purely on fear of punishment. These professional military forces also provided alternative career paths for the hereditary executioners and dungeon guards whose families had managed medieval prison systems for generations. Many found employment in standing armies where their skills in violence and discipline could be channeled toward external rather than internal enemies. The development of more sophisticated siege warfare and artillery made traditional castle-based prison systems increasingly obsolete. The thick walls and underground chambers that had made medieval dungeons escape-proof became liabilities when faced with gunpowder weapons. New fortress designs prioritized defense against artillery rather than prisoner containment. Urban growth during the late medieval period created new challenges that traditional dungeon systems couldn't address effectively. Large cities needed justice systems that could process hundreds of cases quickly, rather than systems designed for the intensive interrogation of individual prisoners. Mass imprisonment became impractical when urban populations reached tens of thousands of people. The rise of banking and credit systems created new forms of economic crime that couldn't be addressed through traditional dungeon justice. Fraud, embezzlement, and complex commercial required legal expertise disputes rather than physical coercion to resolve. The sophisticated financial relationships that drove late medieval economic growth were incompatible with justice systems based primarily on confession extraction through torture. Colonial expansion also contributed to prison reform by creating alternative destinations for unwanted populations. Rather than maintaining expensive prison systems, European powers began transporting criminals to colonial territories where their labour could be put to productive use. This transportation system reduced prison populations while generating economic benefits for colonial enterprises. The intellectual revolution of the Renaissance brought new philosophical frameworks for thinking about human nature, social organisation, and the purposes of government. Humanist thinkers like Erasmus and Montaigne questioned whether systematic cruelty was compatible with human dignity and social progress. Their ideas gradually penetrated educated circles and influenced legal reforms. The rediscovery of classical texts also provided alternative models for justice systems. Roman law offered more sophisticated procedures for determining guilt and innocence than the confession-based systems that dominated medieval practice. Greek philosophical texts provided intellectual frameworks for thinking about justice that emphasized reason over force. Scientific developments during the Renaissance also undermined some of the assumptions that supported medieval dungeon systems. Better understanding of anatomy made trial by ordeal seem less credible as a method for determining divine judgment. Improved medical knowledge revealed that confessions extracted under extreme physical stress were unreliable indicators of truth. The growth of universities and scholarly communities created networks of educated individuals who could compare different legal systems and advocate for reforms. These intellectual networks spread across political boundaries, creating international communities of legal scholars who shared ideas about justice reform. The printing and distribution of legal commentaries allowed local legal practitioners to learn about innovations in other regions and pressure their own authorities for similar reforms. Legal treatises that described alternative approaches to criminal justice became bestsellers among educated elites who had previously accepted medieval practices as inevitable. But the transition from medieval dungeon systems to more modern forms of justice wasn't uniform across Europe. Some regions reformed their practices gradually over centuries, while others maintained brutal prison conditions well into the modern period. The pace of change depended on local political, economic, and cultural factors that varied significantly across different territories. England led early prison reforms, partly because its island geography created different security needs than continental powers faced. The English Channel provided natural protection that reduced reliance on fear-based internal control systems. English legal innovations like habeas corpus and trial by jury emerged partly from this reduced dependence on arbitrary detention. France reformed its justice system more slowly, partly because its land borders and complex internal politics created ongoing needs for strong internal control systems. The French monarchy maintained elements of medieval dungeon justice well into the 18th century, contributing to the revolutionary pressures that eventually exploded in 1789. German territories showed the most variation in prison reform, with some principalities leading European innovations while others maintained medieval practices. The fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire allowed for experimentation with different approaches, but also permitted the survival of particularly brutal local systems. Spanish and Portuguese prison systems evolved differently due to their extensive colonial empires. The availability of colonial territories as destinations for unwanted populations reduced pressure for domestic prison reform while creating new forms of systematic oppression in overseas territories. Italian city-states generally led prison reforms due to their commercial needs and Renaissance intellectual culture. However, papal territories often maintained more traditional approaches due to religious conservatism and the Church's investment in existing theological justifications for harsh punishment. The transformation of medieval dungeons also created new problems that reformers hadn't anticipated. As arbitrary detention became less common, other forms of social control became more important. Economic coercion, social ostracism, and bureaucratic manipulation replaced physical torture as primary means of maintaining order. The professionalization of legal systems created new forms of injustice based on technical expertise rather than brute force. Legal complexity became a barrier that prevented ordinary people from understanding or challenging the systems that governed their lives. Justice became more predictable, but also more remote, from popular participation and control. The rise of centralized state power eliminated many local arbitrariness, but created new possibilities for systematic oppression on much larger scales. When medieval lords abused their power, the damage was limited to their immediate territories. When centralized states became oppressive, entire populations could be subjected to systematic persecution. The economic factors that drove prison reform also created new vulnerabilities. When justice systems became dependent on economic productivity, they became vulnerable to manipulation by wealthy interests who could use their economic power to influence legal outcomes. The replacement of arbitrary noble power with systematic commercial influence wasn't necessarily an improvement for ordinary people. The international nature of Renaissance legal reform also created new forms of cultural imperialism. European legal systems were imposed on other cultures through colonial expansion, destroying indigenous justice systems that might have been more appropriate for local conditions. The spread of European legal innovations became part of broader patterns of cultural domination. Modern prison systems that emerged from medieval dungeon reforms carried forward many assumptions and practices from their predecessors. The emphasis on isolation, the use of architecture to control behavior, and the belief that punishment should involve suffering all have medieval roots that persist in contemporary corrections. The bureaucratization of justice that replaced medieval arbitrariness created its own forms of systematic oppression. When cruelty becomes standardized and rationalized through professional procedures, it can become more extensive and harder to challenge than the personal brutality of medieval dungeons. The psychological techniques developed in medieval interrogation chambers influenced modern approaches to questioning and behavioral control. While physical torture became less acceptable, psychological manipulation became more sophisticated and systematic. The medieval understanding of how to break human resistance informed later developments in psychology and social control. The architectural principles pioneered in medieval prison design continue to influence facilities. The use of isolation, correct contemporary, surveillance, and environmental control to shape prisoner behavior represents direct continuity with medieval dungeon practices, even when the specific methods have been modernized. The legal precedents established through medieval prison cases continue to influence contemporary justice systems in ways that most people don't recognize. The procedures for handling evidence, the standards for confessions, and the relationship between church and state in criminal justice all have medieval origins that persist today. The economic relationships that developed around medieval prison systems established patterns that continue in contemporary privatized corrections. The use of prisoner labor, the profit incentives around incarceration, and the political benefits of appearing tough on crime all have medieval precedents that help explain modern prison policies. The cultural legacy of medieval dungeons extends beyond their direct institutional influence to shape popular attitudes toward crime, punishment, and justice. The stories, images, and metaphors that emerge from medieval prison experiences continue to influence how contemporary societies think about appropriate responses to criminal behavior. The international legal principles that emerged from medieval experiences with cross-border imprisonment established foundations for modern international law human rights protections. The gradual recognition that certain treatment of prisoners violates universal standards represents evolution from medieval practices toward more humane approaches. But perhaps the most important lesson from the transformation of medieval dungeons isn't about the progress that was made, but about how fragile and reversible that progress has proven to be. The same economic, political, and social pressures that drove medieval prison reforms can also drive reversals toward more brutal practices. The 20th century demonstrated repeatedly that supposedly civilized societies could quickly revert to systematic imprisonment, torture, and mass murder when political and economic pressures created incentives for such practices. The Nazi concentration camps, Soviet gulags, and other modern atrocities showed that medieval-style oppression could be implemented on industrial scales using modern technology and bureaucratic methods. Contemporary developments in many countries show concerning parallels to the conditions that created medieval dungeon systems. Growing economic inequality, political polarization, and social fragmentation create pressures that historically have led to increased reliance on fear-based control systems. The privatization of prison systems in many countries has recreated some of the profit incentives that drove medieval prison abuses. When private companies benefit financially from high incarceration rates, they have interests that conflict with justice, rehabilitation, and crime reduction. The development of new surveillance technologies has created possibilities for systematic monitoring and control that medieval authorities could never have imagined. While these technologies can be used to protect human rights, they also create unprecedented opportunities for systematic oppression. The rise of international terrorism and other security threats has led some contemporary societies to revive medieval practices, including indefinite detention, systematic torture, and secret imprisonment. These practices are often justified using the same arguments that medieval authorities used to defend their dungeon systems. The psychological insights gained from medieval prison experiences continue to inform both oppressive and liberating practices. The same understanding of human behavior that can be used to break resistance can also be used to build resilience and promote recovery from trauma. The study of medieval prison resistance movements provides valuable knowledge for contemporary human rights advocates. The communication networks, mutual support systems, and strategic thinking that medieval prisoners developed remain relevant tools for opposing oppression in any era. The architectural preservation of medieval prison sites serves important educational functions that help contemporary societies understand the historical development of justice systems and the importance of maintaining human rights protections. The international scholarly collaboration that has developed around medieval prison studies demonstrates the global relevance of these historical experiences and their continued importance for understanding contemporary justice systems. The educational curricula that have emerged from medieval prison studies provide important tools for teaching about human rights, social justice, and the historical development of legal systems. But ultimately, the most important lesson from our exploration of medieval dungeons isn't about the past at all. It's about recognizing our own responsibility for preventing the recurrence of systematic oppression in any form. The guards who operated medieval dungeons weren't monsters. They were ordinary people who had gradually accepted that systematic cruelty was necessary, inevitable, and even virtuous. They were neighbors, family members, and respected community leaders who had allowed themselves to become complicit in systematic dehumanization. The judges who condemned innocence, the officials who profited from human suffering, and the citizens who ignored or supported these systems were also ordinary people operating within structures that normalized and rewarded participation in oppression. The transformation of these brutal systems didn't happen automatically or inevitably. It required the sustained effort of individuals who refused to accept that cruelty was normal or necessary. It demanded courage from people who risked their own safety to challenge systems that seemed as permanent and unshakable as stone walls. The human rights protections we often take for granted today exist because previous generations fought against systems of oppression that seemed as entrenched and inevitable as medieval dungeons once appeared. These protections remain fragile and require constant vigilance to maintain. The capacity for both systematic cruelty and principled resistance that medieval dungeons revealed remains unchanged in human nature. The choice between becoming complicit in oppression or standing with its victims presents itself anew in every generation, in every society, and in countless individual decisions that shape the character of our shared world. The stone walls of medieval dungeons have crumbled, but the human dynamics they contained continue to play out in new forms adapted to contemporary circumstances. Understanding this dark chapter of our shared history prepares us to recognize and oppose similar systems whenever and wherever they emerge. The echoes of medieval dungeons remind us that civilization is not a permanent achievement, but a fragile construction that requires constant maintenance and defense. The distance between our contemporary societies and the brutal prison systems of the medieval world is measured not in centuries, but in the daily choices we make about how we treat the most vulnerable members of our communities. Tonight, we've descended into some of the darkest chapters of human history, but we've also discovered stories of remarkable courage, ingenuity, and resilience. The prisoners who maintained their humanity under conditions designed to destroy it, who helped their fellow inmates survive, and who never stopped hoping for freedom, remind us that the human spirit cannot be completely broken, no matter how sophisticated the systems designed to crush it. Their example both provides inspiration and practical knowledge for recognizing and opposing oppression wherever it appears. The communication networks they built, the resistance movements they created, and the hope they maintained in hopeless circumstances offer timeless lessons about the power of human connection and dignity. As we emerge from this exploration, we carry with us not just knowledge of historical atrocities, but understanding of the eternal struggle between the forces that would dehumanize us and our capacity to maintain our humanity regardless of circumstances. The medieval dungeon stands as both warning and inspiration, reminding us that systematic oppression is always possible but never inevitable, that individual choices matter enormously in shaping collective outcomes, and that the price of human dignity is eternal vigilance against the forces that would strip it away. In every generation, in every society, the choice between becoming a dungeon guard or standing with the prisoners presents itself anew. The medieval dungeon reminds us that this choice matters, that individual decisions about complicity and resistance shape the character of entire civilizations. The darkness we've explored tonight isn't safely contained in the distant past. It lives in the human capacity for both cruelty and courage that exists in every era. Understanding this history prepares us to recognize these patterns when they emerge in contemporary forms, and gives us tools for choosing resistance over complicity. The stone walls have crumbled and the iron chains have rusted away, but the lessons carved into those underground chambers remain as relevant today as they were centuries ago. The medieval dungeon teaches us that the struggle for human dignity is never finished, that freedom requires constant vigilance, and that the choice between light and darkness presents itself anew with each generation. Tonight we close this chapter on medieval dungeons, but the story continues. In every decision we make about how to treat others, in every choice between indifference and action when we witness injustice, in every moment when we must decide whether to stand with the powerful or the powerless, we write the next chapter in this eternal story of human struggle. The medieval dungeon reminds us that we are all capable of both great evil and great good, that systems of oppression depend on our complicity to survive, and that individual acts of courage and compassion can ultimately transform even the most brutal circumstances. The darkness we've explored tonight serves not to discourage but to illuminate, showing us both the depths to which human societies can sink and the heights to which individual courage can rise. In understanding this history, we gain tools for building a future where the nightmares of medieval dungeons remain safely in the past where they belong. The legacy of medieval dungeons extends far beyond their crumbling stones and rusted iron. These chambers of systematic suffering fundamentally shaped how Western civilization approaches questions of justice, punishment, and human dignity. But to truly understand their lasting impact, we need to examine how the knowledge gained from centuries of systematic oppression influenced fields as diverse as psychology, architecture, law enforcement, and even modern medicine. Medieval prison administrators developed sophisticated understandings of human behavior under extreme stress that wouldn't be formally recognized by academic psychology for centuries. They understood that isolation could break the human spirit more effectively than physical violence. They knew that unpredictability was more psychologically devastating than consistent brutality. They recognized that hope followed by disappointment could shatter mental resistance faster than despair alone. These insights weren't theoretical knowledge gained through scholarly study. They were practical techniques refined through generations of professional experience in breaking human resistance. The hereditary nature of many prison positions meant that psychological manipulation techniques were passed down through families like trade secrets, constantly refined and improved through direct observation of their effects. The environmental psychology pioneered in medieval dungeons influenced architectural approaches to social control that persist today. The use of lighting, space, sound, and visual elements to influence behavior was first systematically explored in medieval prison design. Modern correctional facilities, psychiatric institutions, and even commercial spaces still employ principles first developed in medieval torture chambers. Consider how modern shopping malls use architectural elements to influence consumer behavior. The deliberate manipulation of sight lines, the strategic placement of rest areas, the use of lighting to create emotional responses. All these techniques have roots in medieval understanding of how physical environment shapes psychological state. The knowledge was first developed to break prisoners, but it proved equally effective at influencing any human behavior. The interrogation techniques developed in medieval chambers established psychological principles that informed everything from police questioning to modern advertising. The systematic use of repetition, the strategic deployment of hope and fear, the careful timing of pressure and relief. These methods were first perfected on prisoners who had no choice but to participate in the experiments. Medieval interrogators understood that different personality types responded to different forms of pressure. They developed classification systems for prisoners that allowed them to customize their approaches based on individual psychological profiles. A proud nobleman required different techniques than a frightened peasant. A devout religious believer could be manipulated through spiritual threats, while a merchant might respond better to economic pressure. This systematic approach to psychological manipulation established foundations for modern understanding of human personality and behavior. The Myers-Briggs personality classifications used in contemporary psychology and business have medieval precedents in the prisoner classification systems developed by professional torturers who needed to predict how different people would respond to specific forms of pressure. The medical knowledge gained from systematically observing human beings under extreme physical and psychological stress contributed to medieval understanding of anatomy, disease, and the limits of human endurance. Prison physicians developed expertise in treating malnutrition, infectious diseases, and trauma that was unavailable to doctors working with healthier populations. The systematic documentation of prisoner and mortality morbidity provided early examples of epidemiological research. Prison administrators needed to understand disease transmission patterns to prevent outbreaks that kill valuable prisoners before they could be properly interrogated or executed. This practical necessity drove innovations in medical record keeping and disease prevention that influenced broader medical practice. Medieval prison physicians also gained unique insights into the relationship between psychological stress and physical health. They observed how prolonged isolation, fear, physical, and despair could cause symptoms that had no apparent medical cause. This understanding of psychosomatic illness was centuries ahead of formal medical recognition of these connections. The surgical techniques developed to treat torture victims provided medieval physicians with opportunities to study human anatomy that weren't available through normal medical practice. The systematic nature of torture injuries allowed doctors to observe healing processes, infection patterns, and the effects of different types of trauma in ways that contributed to general medical knowledge. The pharmaceutical knowledge developed to keep prisoners conscious during torture or to treat their injuries afterward influenced broader medical understanding of pain management, anesthesia, and drug interactions. Medieval prison physicians became specialists in walking the fine line between keeping patients alive and maintaining their capacity to experience pain. The legal innovations that emerged from medieval prison systems established precedents that continue to influence contemporary justice. The systematic documentation of confessions, the procedures for validating testimony obtained under duress, and the standards for evidence in criminal cases all have roots in medieval legal developments driven by the needs of prison administrators. The concept of due process, which modern legal systems consider fundamental to justice, emerged partly as a reaction against the arbitrary nature of medieval dungeon justice. The recognition that legal procedures should follow predictable patterns rather than the whims of individual authorities developed through centuries of experience with systems that lacked such protections. The modern understanding of what constitutes cruel and unusual punishment has its roots in medieval experiences with systematic torture. The legal principles that prohibit certain forms of prisoner treatment developed through historical recognition of the abuses that occurred when such limits didn't exist. The right to legal representation, the presumption of innocence, and protection against self-incrimination all emerged as responses to medieval legal systems that lacked these protections. Contemporary legal rights exist because previous generations experienced what happened when such rights didn't exist. The international legal principles that govern the treatment of prisoners of war and political detainees developed partly from medieval experiences with cross-border imprisonment and diplomatic detention. The recognition that certain standards should apply regardless of local law represents evolution from medieval practices toward more universal approaches. The bureaucratic innovations developed to manage large prison populations influenced broader administrative practices in medieval government and beyond. The record-keeping systems, resource management techniques, and organizational structures pioneered in medieval prisons were later applied to other areas of public administration. Modern governmental bureaucracies still employ organizational principles first developed in medieval prison systems. The hierarchical command structures, the systematic documentation procedures, and the performance evaluation methods used in contemporary public administration all have precedence in medieval prison management. The economic analysis techniques developed to assess the costs and benefits of different imprisonment strategies influenced broader approaches to public policy and resource allocation. Medieval authorities needed to balance the political benefits of harsh punishment against the economic costs of maintaining prison populations, leading to early forms of cost-benefit analysis. The logistics systems developed to supply medieval prisons with food, materials, and personnel established precedents for modern supply chain management. The challenges of maintaining isolated facilities with complex security requirements drove innovations in transportation, storage, and distribution that influenced broader economic development. The communication networks developed to coordinate between different prison facilities established early examples of administrative communication systems that influenced broader governmental and commercial practices. The need to share information about prisoners, transfer individuals between facilities, and coordinate security measures required sophisticated information management systems. The technological innovations that emerged from medieval prison construction influenced broader developments in engineering, metallurgy, and architecture. The specialized locks, reinforced doors, and surveillance systems developed for prisons drove innovations that were later applied to banks, treasuries, military fortifications, and civilian construction. The development of increasingly sophisticated restraint systems pushed advances in metallurgy and mechanical engineering. The precision required torture devices drove for effective innovations in gear systems, leverage mechanisms, and material science that had applications far beyond prison use. The surveillance techniques developed to monitor prisoner behavior established early approaches to systematic observation that influenced everything from military intelligence to scientific research methods. The systematic recording of human behavior under controlled conditions provided models for later experimental psychology and social science research. The architectural principles pioneered in medieval prison design influenced broader approaches to building construction and urban planning. The use of space to control movement, the manipulation of light and sound to influence behavior, and the integration of security features into structural design all had applications beyond prison construction. The social control mechanisms developed in medieval prisons influenced broader approaches to managing populations and maintaining order. The systematic use of isolation, the strategic deployment of rewards and punishments, and the careful manipulation of social hierarchies among prisoners established techniques that were later applied to other institutions. Medieval monasteries adopted many organizational and disciplinary techniques from contemporary prison systems, recognizing that the psychological principles developed for controlling prisoners could also be effective for managing religious communities. The similarities between monastic rules and prison regulations reveal how knowledge flowed between different types of institutional control. Educational institutions also borrowed from medieval prison practices using isolation, systematic surveillance, and behavioral modification techniques that had been pioneered in correctional settings. The authoritarian structures that characterized medieval schools and universities had clear precedents in contemporary prison administration. Military organizations adopted many medieval prison innovations, particularly in areas of discipline, hierarchy, and the systematic breaking down of individual resistance to create unit cohesion. The techniques developed to transform prisoners into compliant subjects proved equally effective at transforming civilians into soldiers. The economic systems that developed around medieval prisons influenced broader approaches to labor organization and resource extraction. The use of forced labor, the systematic exploitation of human resources, and the development of profit incentives around human suffering established patterns that appeared in later economic institutions. The plantation systems that emerged in European colonies borrowed heavily from medieval prison labor practices. The systematic dehumanization techniques, the hierarchical control structures, and the economic models developed in medieval prisons provided templates for later systems of systematic exploitation. Industrial labor practices during the early stages of capitalist development also showed clear influences from medieval prison systems. The systematic surveillance of workers, the use of disciplinary techniques to maintain productivity, and the development of hierarchical management structures all had precedents in medieval prison administration. The psychological warfare techniques developed in medieval prisons influenced military and political strategies that extended far beyond individual institutions. The systematic use of fear, the strategic deployment of uncertainty, and the careful manipulation of hope and despair became standard tools of statecraft and international relations. Medieval diplomatic practices borrowed many techniques from contemporary prison systems, using isolation, psychological pressure, and systematic demoralization to influence foreign ambassadors and negotiators. The same principles that broke individual prisoners proved effective at influencing entire governments. The propaganda techniques that emerged from medieval prison experiences influenced broader approaches to mass communication and social control. The systematic manipulation of information, the strategic use of fear and uncertainty, and the careful timing of revelations and concealments became standard tools of political manipulation. The cultural impact of medieval prison systems extended far beyond their direct institutional influence to shape art, literature, and popular imagination in ways that continue to influence contemporary society. The stories, images, and metaphors that emerged from medieval prison experiences became part of the cultural vocabulary that people used to understand power, authority, and resistance. Gothic literature drew and themes heavily from medieval prison imagery, creating artistic frameworks that continue to influence how people think about darkness, confinement, and the abuse of power. The castle dungeons that populate horror stories and romantic novels carry cultural memories of real medieval institutions. The religious imagery that emerged from medieval prison experiences influenced theological thinking about sin, punishment, and redemption in ways that shaped Christian doctrine and practice. The systematic torture that characterized medieval justice provided models for understanding divine punishment that influenced religious art, literature, and popular belief. The political metaphors that developed from medieval prison experiences continue to influence how people think about government, authority, and individual rights. Terms like dungeon, torture chamber, and inquisition carry cultural weight that extends far beyond their historical origins. The psychological insights gained from medieval prison experiences contributed to broader cultural understandings of human nature, social relationships, and the dynamics of power. The recognition that ordinary people could become systematically cruel under certain circumstances influenced philosophical and political thinking about the nature of civilization and the necessity of institutional safeguards. The artistic representations of medieval prisons influenced visual culture in ways that continue to shape how people imagine confinement, suffering, and resistance. The iconography developed medieval prison imagery appears around in everything from political cartoons to commercial advertising, carrying cultural meanings that most people recognize intuitively. The literary traditions that emerge from medieval prison experiences establish narrative frameworks that continue to influence storytelling across all media. The themes of unjust imprisonment, systematic oppression, and individual resistance that characterize much contemporary fiction have clear precedents in medieval prison literature. The musical traditions that developed around medieval prison experiences, from work songs that helped prisoners coordinate resistance to lamentations that expressed their suffering, influenced folk music traditions that continue to carry cultural memories of systematic oppression. The oral traditions that preserve stories of medieval prison experiences provided models for understanding and discussing systematic abuse that continue to influence how communities process and respond to institutional violence. The educational legacy of medieval prisons extends beyond formal historical study to influence how societies teach about justice, human rights, and social responsibility. The preserved sites and documented experiences provide concrete examples that help people understand abstract principles about the importance of legal protections and institutional safeguards. The moral education that emerges from studying medieval prisons helps people understand the difference between legal authority and legitimate authority, between following orders and accepting moral responsibility, between being a bystander and being complicit in systematic abuse. The civic education that medieval prison history provides helps people understand the fragility of democratic institutions and the importance of active citizenship in maintaining accountable government. The examples of how quickly civilized societies can descend into systematic oppression provide powerful arguments for maintaining vigilant oversight of a government power. The international education that emerges from comparative study of medieval prison systems helps people understand both universal patterns in human behavior and specific cultural factors that can either facilitate or prevent systematic abuse. This knowledge provides tools for recognizing and responding to contemporary forms of institutional violence. The professional education that medieval prison studies provide for people working in criminal justice, mental health, social work, and related fields helps them understand the historical development of their professions and the ongoing challenges of maintaining ethical standards under institutional pressure. The research methodologies developed for studying medieval prisons have influenced broader approaches to investigating historical trauma, systematic abuse, and institutional violence. The techniques developed for analyzing fragmentary evidence, corroborating testimony, and reconstructing experiences from limited sources have applications across many fields of historical and social research. The ethical frameworks that have emerged from studying medieval prisons provide guidelines for conducting research into sensitive topics, working with vulnerable populations, and maintaining professional standards when investigating systematic abuse. These frameworks help ensure that contemporary research doesn't replicate the exploitative relationships that characterized medieval prison systems. The preservation techniques developed for maintaining medieval prison sites and artifacts provide models for conserving other historical sites that document systematic violence and institutional abuse. The approaches developed for presenting difficult historical material to diverse audiences help ensure that these lessons remain accessible to future generations. The shadows of medieval dungeons still stretch across our modern world, reminding us that the distance between civilization and barbarism is measured not in centuries, but in the choices we make each day. These weren't just historical curiosities or distant nightmares from a forgotten age. They were real places where real people suffered, where ordinary individuals became complicit in systematic cruelty, and where the human spirit somehow endured against impossible odds. Tonight we've journeyed through stone corridors where hope went to die, but we've also discovered something remarkable. Even in humanity's darkest moments, even when every system was designed to crush dignity and break spirits, people found ways to resist, to connect, to maintain their humanity. The prisoners who scratched messages into dungeon walls, who shared their meagre rations with fellow inmates, who never stopped planning for freedom, remind us that no system of oppression can completely extinguish the human spirit. The medieval dungeon stands as both warning and inspiration. It warns us how quickly societies can descend into systematic cruelty when we abandon our moral guardrails and stop questioning authority. But it also inspires us with stories of courage, ingenuity, and resilience that prove human dignity can survive even the most brutal circumstances. The choice between becoming a dungeon guard or standing with the prisoners presents itself anew in every generation. The medieval dungeon reminds us that this choice matters, that our individual decisions about complicity and resistance shape the character of entire civilizations. As we close this chapter, remember that the price of human dignity is eternal vigilance, and the shadows of the past can only be kept at bay by the light we choose to kindle today.